there's a lot there to enjoy. And one of the things that's really cool about it is because with that squad composition, but it uses a tactics mode, and which is similar to the Gambit system that was in Final Fantasy XII for your squad mates. And you can say, okay, well, Hodrick, who's my legionnaire with the big shield, I want him to prioritize protecting the back row, because the back row are the squishiest. They're going to take the most damage. If they take a physical hit, they're going to go down, but I need them to be protected. So we put Hodrick in the line of fire effectively. You can get quite granular with this, and I reckon you could build some pretty wild builds that are, totally game breaking. But it's kind of the fun of the tactical squad based gameplay in Unicorn Overlord.
SIFTER.com.au.
G'day, I'm Chris Button, and this is Drop Rate, Sifter's video game review podcast. Unicorn Overlord is the latest hardcore strategy game from acclaimed Japanese developer Vanillaware, and Sifter's own Gianni Di Giovanni dived in, putting many hours in to find out if it's worth your time.
Join the Sifter community on Discord at sifter.com.au/Discord.
So, Gianni, Unicorn Overlord, bit of a funny name. What does that actually mean, and what is this game?
Terrible name, means nothing. It's completely, well, there is a bit of context to it, but, if you're trying to describe it to people, and as I have been trying to do, recommend it to people, they go, what is that? What are you talking about? Anyway, so Unicorn Overlord, as you said, is by Vanillaware, who is a sort of strategy. They make a lot of sort of 2D style games with and a lot of side-scrolling-y sort of stuff as well. So people probably might have played their most recent game, which is called 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, which is sort of a sci-fi visual novel with a bit of a strategy element to it as well.
Brilliant game.
It's a really good game, underrated game, and I think a lot of people missed it when it came out, but definitely one of those really interesting titles. But it's a series. Unicorn Overlord is a grand fantasy role-playing game. It has a lot of the same bits and pieces that you might recognize from something like a Fire Emblem. It feels thematically a bit like a Fire Emblem, but it plays pretty differently, and it's all about managing lots of different tactical squads, different classes within that, and also trying to balance out particular abilities against other classes. So really what you're trying to do is manage your resources within a battle, and then also try to, bring your strongest troops to the battlefield. There's all sorts of stuff that you would love from one of those games. There's equipment, there's places to discover, there's side quests, there's a romance subplot. It's got everything that the JRPG fantasy player loves to enjoy. And it's one of the most enjoyable pick-up-and play games that I've played in a very in the last little bit. It's perfect for just playing a little bit. And maybe the sort of game you could fit in nicely in and amongst some of the bigger titles that require a lot more of you.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so interesting because I played a little bit of Unicorn Overlord myself, having played the entirety of 13 Sentinels, which is one of my favourite games in recent years. And one of the big differences from my sort of immediate impressions of Unicorn Overlord is that it's perhaps not quite as narratively dense as 13 Sentinels, or at least it doesn't front load that into the early part of the experience. Does that track with your time with Unicorn Overlord in terms of this game is perhaps for people who want a mechanically meaty game as opposed to the mind-bending sort of time-altering narrative that 13 Sentinels wowed plenty of us with?
Yeah, look, definitely. I think if you look at a game like 13 Sentinels, which was much more about puzzling out a sort of complex and twisty story, this is much more straightforward. It's a standard, Prince Elaine, who was the son of the Queen, he's the heir to the throne of Cornea, has been forced out after a general of the former empire betrayed the kingdom, basically, and took over and crowned himself as emperor. And so basically the whole idea is that what you're trying to do is trying to reclaim the throne, but also free the different kingdoms that were originally separate sort of kingdoms all around the kingdom of Cornea, like Elheim, where all the elves live, and Bastorius, where all the sort of beast people, the furry people live, and all of these other ones. So you're basically trying to save all those different kingdoms from this evil empire, and it's pretty straightforward. Sort of, you're up against a Sauron sort of character effectively, and kind of working your way through that sort of plot. But what's quite cool about it is that there's lots of those little threads for you to pull on, and as you kind of move your way through different areas, you kind of get a different picture about how each of these particular cultures were impacted by this invading army. So, for example, that the elves were kind of off in their own little secluded forest for a while, and then they, the first big interaction they had with humans, the human empire, was that they came in and brought their invading army and sort of subjugated and sold the elves off and enslaved them and things like that. So, there's a bit of skepticism when you are another invading army, this time on the side of liberation, but there is a bit of skepticism there, and you kind of have to build up the trust as you're going through. And look, it's not, Game of Thrones level complexity or anything like that, but it is it has a nice sort of pretty approachable and pretty nicely paced storyline that you can kind of pick at in whatever direction you like, because the world itself, you've got the kind of the Fevrith, which is the sort of island continent that's all the communities are kind of based around, is split up into these little different sections. And yeah, they're kind of gated by level. So you are expected to kind of go in a particular direction, but once you've kind of made it through the first part of the main kingdom of Cornea, the central kingdom, you can decide whether or not you want to head off into the desert land and where all the dragons used to live, but there's none left anymore, so it's just skeletons everywhere, or do you want to head off into the direction of the elves? So I think you can kind of follow where you want, and it's really easy to move between bits and pieces as well. So you're not stuck in a path. For example, if you decide you want to do a bit of the desert and it's getting you down, or you want to improve your the availability of classes that you have access to, you can just decide to jump on over to where the elves campaign is straight away and jump in there as well. So it's, as you sort of started by asking, it's not got that mind twisty aspect. The challenge and the enjoyable part of this is more of the tactical and systems-based gameplay, rather than a game that you will be thinking about the story for years to come. Look, it's fine. The story is fine. It's slightly better than fine. I'd say it's good, but it's nothing you're going to be remembering for years and years to come, I don't think, at this stage. But I'm about 40 hours in or so it hasn't wowed me in the same way. I was just kind of like on the edge of my seat, like in 13 Sentinels.
As long as it's not the drastic drop that I experienced between Fire Emblem Three Houses and then Fire Emblem Engage, I think I'll be just fine. But that mechanical complexity, again, as to reiterate, is very much the star of the show here with Unicorn Overlord. And from what I've played, as you say, it's very interesting, sort of navigating this overworld, interacting with the various sort of citizens of the regions, and you do have a lot of flexibility and freedom to tackle things in various order within reason, because there are things that are sort of level gated as well. There are things that you certainly wouldn't be able to attempt straight up, otherwise you have no chance in hell of succeeding. But I think to go back to the core elements of this game, it's a really interesting take on what I feel the auto battler genre, which I think has sort of increased in popularity, or has sort of become popularized in recent years with some a few games on Steam and some browser-based games as well. But this certainly cranks up the sort of auto battler strategy up to 11, with a lot of the unit sort of customizations and the way that you can sort of position your units within a battle, because you've got these two rows where you can have your frontline units who are good at dealing damage, taking hits, backed up by people on the back row who are support or healers or archers, those who still have a lot of utility but aren't necessarily going to be ones who will be able to bear the brunt of a lot of damage from opposition sort of units and battalions. So tell me about how this combat system works and how you navigate your way through battles and sort of what's so satisfying about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Auto battlers kind of came to mind as well when I was thinking of this game. And it's sort of because when you kind of build these little squads, I think your initial thought when you see the game being played is that you'd actually be selecting commands, because it kind of feels a bit like almost like an old school Final Fantasy, like a side-scrolling sort of game. So that's what it looks like when you play it. But what happens is you assemble your squads and pick the equipment that they're going to be using, and then you basically move them around the map and come up against enemies. And much like in Fire Emblem, you're kind of given an indication how you're going to go before you actually get into the battle. So basically, you can kind of choose at that stage, you might be in a real tactical disadvantage. So you've got the opportunity that if enemies are nearby another unit that you have, you can kind of swap them directly. It doesn't matter if they're right in the line of fire, basically. You can just do a straight swap. So, quite often I had a squad of healers who were nearby my main attacking army, and they sometimes would get caught offside by like a fast-moving flying enemy, for example, that kind of scout around me. But because they were close enough to my main sort of hero squad, I was able to very quickly swap them between the two. And the good thing about that is you're kind of just building up lots of different little additions to each battle that you do. So, for example, if my healer squad is getting attacked directly, they can heal within that battle, and that's part of the actual gameplay part of it. So, everything kind of runs in a script order. There are many of these sort of RPGs which kind of run in this sort of like turn-based order, and you can move your things up and down the initiative. But for example, if I move them out of the actual combat and put my my heavy-hitting heroes in instead, that squad that's now not in the direct fire can actually provide a healing assist if I've made that particular person the leader, like the healer, one of the healers of the leaders of the squad. So, you can actually think about your composition of how you who you make the leader of each particular squad that you have to give you sort of situational bonuses within each of the battles in the game. But you can also, for example, have 3 healers in the back row, which makes for a really good one. Or you might just want to have 1 healer there and actually give that squad a number of quite heavy hitters as well. So you can make the healer the hero so that they give you the leader, the advantage in the tactical mode. But in the battles, you can fill it with knights and still have pack quite a punch as well. So that composition between what units you put into each squad in the 2 rows that you have, you've got 2 rows of 3. So there's 6 potential positions, and you can upgrade to 5 units max, which by the time you've gotten to that point, you're pretty powerful. So, you can really make complex sort of squads. And it's all about thinking about those particular synergies between each of the classes that you've got in the squad. So, for an example, I'm going to take you through my main squad where Elaine, the protagonist of the game, is in. So, Elaine has a pretty strong. He's an armored knight. He's got a pretty strong ability that means that he can, anytime he attacks anyone, he gets a proportion of his health back. He's got a health steal sort of ability, but he's also got quite a strong shield ability as well, which means that he can basically protect some of the other weaker units. In that squad, I've also got Hodrick, who's like a large sort of legionnaire character. He was a hopliter, with a spear and a very large shield, and it's just a tank and basically just takes damage and buffs the other members of the squad to reduce the amount of damage they take. I've got an elven fencer who also sits on the front line, has a reasonable amount of health, probably middle health, but has the sort of combination magical and physical attacks. So is sort of doing sword strikes and then blasting them with lightning. And then in my back row, I've got a spear-wielding soldier, which can attack in their own right as well, who's pretty strong at that. But most of the time is spending their points within the battle buffing different abilities. So they will give guaranteed hits, for example, to particular spells. So any other modifiers get wiped out, or they'll make sure that every hit you get is a critical hit. So that's really improving your ability. And finally, in the last member of my squad is a is a witch, and she's got powerful magical abilities, but also has that same sort of thing where she can buff different characters when they're about to do their moves as well. So, there's a lot of these little bits and pieces you can put to kind of combine your squads, and you can kind of pick the things that you like between all of those different elements. And so I picked up that, that main squad that I've got is pretty unstoppable now because and pretty much everyone is kind of a vehicle to sort of support those squads. But you think about the composition of other squads to fulfill other tactical aspects of it. So there's a number of flying units, for example, you can have, and they're not impacted by any environmental traps like spike traps or bombs or anything like that, and they just fly over the top of water and all of these sorts of things. So often I'm using them to go and claim far away little control points, which give me this resource which allows me to deploy more squads or use special abilities in the maps as well. So you're kind of balancing all these little aspects, and it's sort of, it's like a semi-real-time game in that, like, a lot of the stuff is sort of turn based, but the movement around the map, you kind of set off all these orders and people kind of move around. And I think probably a game like Phantom Brigade, it was like a mech game that came out a little while ago, is sort of a similar idea. You're basically setting up all your orders and then hoping that the particular squads all come into the right place. So there's a lot there to enjoy. And one of the things that's really cool about it is because with that squad composition, you can actually set tactics and priorities. And this is where it's a bit like Final Fantasy XII as well. If you're listening to this thinking, wow, there's a lot going on in this game. Well, there is, but it's not so complex that you get overwhelmed. But it uses a tactics mode, and which is similar to the Gambit system that was in Final Fantasy XII for your squad mates. And, because of that, you don't control any of them directly. So it's a bit more like you're controlling a whole group of your companions in Final Fantasy XII. And so you can say, okay, well, Hodrick, who's my legionnaire with the big shield, I want him to prioritize protecting the back row, because the back row are the squishiest. They're going to take the most damage. If they take a physical hit, they're going to go down, but I need them to be protected. So we put Hodrick in the line of fire effectively to do that. And, Elaine, who's got his, health stealing attack, I get him to prioritize enemies that are the weakest in the enemy squad, because if he kills an enemy with that particular attack, it doubles the amount of health he gets. He'll get like a small amount, but if he kills them, he gets double as much. So I can set to prioritize the weakest unit. So there's a lot of that really cool stuff that you can do to kind of customize the way that the game actually plays. You can, there's moves because of those two rows of units that you've got. You can say, okay, well, I know I've got a very wide attack that's going to attack the first row entirely. So I'm going to prioritize attacking entire rows so I can do the most damage possible. Or you can say there's a row of a column of two, for example, and you might say, okay, I'm just going to go attack those two specifically rather all of that sort of stuff. You can set priorities for all of these sort of things. So you can get quite granular with this, and I reckon you could build some pretty wild builds that are totally game breaking, but it's kind of the fun of the tactical squad based gameplay in Unicorn Overlord.
Yeah, well, you well and truly preempted the next point I was going to bring up in terms of it's not just unit composition, it's also the order customization of what these units will actually do in battle, because I think people who like conditional programming, conditional formatting, or going really deep into, okay, if X, then Y, there's a lot of this super deep customization, which you don't have to engage with if you don't want to, but for those who really want to min-max and get the absolute most out of their units, their squads, and each combat encounter, then yeah, you can do that because you can set, if someone has both an attack or a support ability, you can set it for that. If their health is below 50% or an ally's health is below 50%, prioritize doing the support action before attacking, or vice versa, and that's just scraping the very absolute surface of the sort of conditional commands that you can program into these units ahead of each encounter. And I think that that's also a big part of Unicorn Overlord, is that there are continual upgrades, there are continual new sort of mechanics or unit types to play around with, because as you mentioned, you can have up to 5 units at any given point, but you only start out with each little battalion being able to house 3 units each. And with each quest that you do, with various upgrade points that you earn through your in-game actions, you can then spend those to upgrade units, level them up, so they get stronger statistically, their base stats improve, but then also increase the amounts of units that you can have within each squad, up to 5, as you said. And going from 3 to 4 units is quite a substantial change, because that then opens up so many other tactical possibilities that you can contend with and play around with. But then also the unit types that you encounter as well, because a lot of the first units are very melee based. They're traditional knights and archers and that sort of thing. Whereas it doesn't take long until you get dedicated support healers, dedicated witches who can do debuffs or penetrate armor more so than physical weapons. So it's a game that keeps evolving and revealing new wrinkles to its systems, which I think lends itself to that philosophy that you said right from the outset, that this is a game ideal for playing in small chunks, having a little bit of an experience here and there, and next time you come back, there'll be something a bit fresh for you to enjoy. But it's also something that you could realistically play for hours on end, and encounter new things as you keep playing. So it's something that Unicorn Overlord did quite well from the little bit that I played as well. But speaking of witches in particular, there's something about Vanillaware that is very much a recurring motif throughout all of its games, and that is of its character designs. And this is quite a good looking game, and they do very interesting things with the art style, which was sort of iterated on 13 Sentinels as well, which was a very visually striking and a game that had a very unique art style. But one thing that has been a constant among Vanillaware games is very much as a depiction of women, and it's impossibly proportioned ones at that, whose back pain I certainly feel for. Was that something that you picked up during your playtime as well, Gianni?
Look, in some characters, they're really cool. Like, you've got a number of them, particularly the women in the game, they look like they're armored soldiers, right? And they look like they're in a fantasy one. I know there's a character called Miriam, for example, who's like this holy knight. And she's got like a bit of a, high ponytail as part of it, just to show that she's a hero character kind of to do this. But, she looks like she could walk into battle. And then, as you said, there's the witches, for example, which are just in basically bikinis with a bit of like mesh top over the top sort of thing and a little mesh skirt thing. And they're kind of hip shaking their way around the battles. And it like those moments are so stark and it's really strange. And it's like very fan servicey in a way that makes me feel like quite uncomfortable. And like it's sort of peppered throughout the game. All of a sudden you just come across a character like the elves, for example, that elven fencer that I mentioned, for example, like they're like basically in the world's smallest leotard, completely exposed to the elements. And like, I'm fighting through a snowy biome at the moment, and it's just completely impractical. And the animations of it it's just got a very, very particular look at the way they depict women in it. And I think most people would think it's pretty gross, actually, if you're looking at it from a 2024 perspective. So, I don't know. It's one of these things where it's like this is probably the major downfall if you're going to put points against this game, is that, all of these things, it really falls into that very sort of juvenile trope of having the buxom lady soldier who's completely in the boob armor, basically, sort of thing. And it doesn't really make any sense. But then on the other side, there are other characters who do it really well. So I don't know. It's not great. It's definitely not great. There's definitely something that is a very strange about the way that they've actually done it. But it's kind of been part of the Vanillaware thing for a really long time. Even 13 Sentinels, which felt pretty toned down in comparison to this. This is much more over the top than 13 Sentinels was. But that one, I remember playing that game and going, whoa, this is just quite full on. So Yeah, I don't know. It's up to you. Depends if this is something that's a deal breaker for you. If you can kind of chalk it up to like this is unfortunately the type of game that they've designed, because on the whole the art is really gorgeous. So it's not an accident that they've done it this way, because it's such an incredibly beautifully designed and drawn game. So yeah, I think you just have to sort of sit with yourself and decide whether or not this is a deal breaker for you in the way that it depicts a lot of the women in this game who, in every other aspect, despite the way that they're being dressed, are kind of written pretty well. There is an element of as well because this is this sort of JRPG and there's sort of a romance facility in that as well. There's kind of like a culminating quest that kind of leads towards that, and there's relationships pretty similar to Fire Emblem. That feels sort of Fire Emblem-y, but from a much more basic perspective.
Thank you, Melisandre.
That's not all I want, though. Once you claim the throne, I'll be expecting a place at your side for real.
Sorry?
Oh, don't worry. I'm not asking to be queen. Just one of the few dozen consorts every king calls upon.
Fascinating, yes. Let's discuss it another time, shall we?
In many ways, it does feel like quite a few of the women who are soldiers in your army are kind of all fawning around you in a way as the main character. Like it's a bit of like a harem anime in a way too. So there's that aspect of it as well, which I think feels like it's just a very big genre trope for this particular type of JRPG. But yeah, I don't know. It's like in terms of like some of the characters are just incredible. There's like a knight who's an angel called Oclise, and she just wears this really cool outfit and she looks like she's ready to go to battle. But I quite like her, and she's not depicted in that way at all. But yeah, then you've got elves like Raylanor who literally look like they're about to do a gymnastics routine, and they've got a few leg greaves on them, and that's about it. So yeah, it's quite over the top in the way that they've designed some of these characters. So mileage may vary on that one.
Yeah, I think that the main thing that makes it egregious in some of the ridiculous character design is the tonal mismatch. Is in that characters, a well written character who owns their sexuality is still a great character, but it's the fact that these characters sort of look the way they do, but there doesn't seem to be any characterization or narrative justification behind it. It's more just ogle these characters for the sake of it.
There is a little bit for the main witch character, Yana, actually in some of the companion quests that you do. You have a couple of the soldiers in your army. When you kind of build up the relationship between, your side characters can also have like conversations with them too. And Yana, for example, Hodrick, who's that big sort of tanky soldier dude that I was talking about before, he, kind of goes, why, I feel a bit off put and overcome by this. But, her storyline is that, she's a witch and she's managed to hide herself away by changing her appearance. And she's like hundreds and hundreds of years old. And she's like, look, I haven't felt like this and looked like this for a really long time. So, I'm kind of taking advantage of the fact that I'm a young person again. So that's the reason why I'm wearing it. As for all the other witches, well, that's just the way the character is designed, So, but they do sort of talk about that a little bit, which I was surprised to see, because obviously they had someone in the office or anyone said, yeah, look, you probably should mention this in some capacity. But yeah, anyway, it's one aspect of a game that is quite complex, and you go, oh, okay, classic Vanillaware. Sort of roll your eyes, be embarrassed as people walk into the house looking at you playing this game, because it's very pervy. So,
yeah, I know I got a few eye rolls from my partner at times. So sort of, but we've had enough anime on the house that it's sort of like, all right, typical anime. But with all that considered, obviously, what really stands out here is the combat and the strategy and how much planning and thinking there is involved in Unicorn Overlord. So do you drop or rate this game, Gianni?
Yeah, look, I definitely rate it. And I think that I played this on the Switch. It runs beautifully on the Switch. It's available also on the Xbox and PlayStation as well. And yeah, I really like it because I think it's quite big. I haven't really even talked about like the fact that there's like world quests as well, so you can kind of go around and liberate different towns, and you're taking resources across and building up those towns. And, there's a whole cooking and relationship thing as well, where you can go and have like these incredibly rendered, beautiful meals with your colleagues and sort of build up these little side quests and conversations with them as well. But yeah, it's a sort of game that's like, it feels, what it reminds me of is a bit like an MMO in that, you can kind of jump into the world and you can kind of go off and complete any number of tasks in any direction. So you can kind of decide what you want to do. So, if you decide you want to mine, go to the mines as like a mining mini game, and you can go and collect a bunch of resources so you can build up a number of towns. You can go do that for a bit. Or if you want to go and, reclaim a few villages or do some side quests through that, you can go do that. Or if you want to build up those relationships and have those character conversations, you can go do that. So the tactical gameplay is really fun. It never got boring at all. I've done hundreds and hundreds of battles now, and if you know that you're going to completely stomp an enemy, that sort of little combat moment can be quite long. So you can go and skip that as well. But you can just jump into a battle and play and have a really fun time. It's actually really enjoyable to do that. So in terms of whether I'd drop it or rate it, I would definitely rate it. It's going to be a game that I think will be another cult hit, because I think Vanillaware games are ones that don't always garner the same, mass reach as other games do. But I think one of these series that I reckon people will continue to play, and I really look forward to seeing the crazy tactical builds that people put together, specifically because there's actually like a multiplayer mode. You can actually fight against other people's squads as well. So once people get completely ridiculous using the systems in this game, I think it'll be really fun to see how this game goes down the track.
Excellent. And from what little I've played so far, I certainly rate it, and I'm looking forward to putting many, many hours into Unicorn Overlord over the next little while.
Sit down for a chat with your pals in video games.
You're listening to SIFTER.
This has been Drop Rate by SIFTER, our video game review podcast. Thank you to Atlas and Sega for providing a review copy of Unicorn Overlord on Nintendo Switch. It's out now on Switch, Xbox, and PlayStation. But in the meantime, Gianni, recently award-winning games journalist, where can people find more of your work?
Yes, you can find all of my stuff on sifter.com.au. I pretty much have a hand in just about everything that we make, so that's probably the best place to go. So I'd recommend, if you want to hear my interviews, I do mostly the interviews on the show Lightmap. That's the main show that I do. We've got a really interesting one coming up with Trent Custers, which may be in the feed by the time you listen to this, from Armello creating League of Geeks. They've also just released Solium Infernum, which is another deep strategy game. So if this sort of game is one that's caught your fancy, and that might be one to check out. And Trent talks pretty candidly about the fact that the studio, which was held up as one of Australia's best and most aspirational studios, came so close to the brink, they were literally having to borrow money against future earnings on things. So it's a really fascinating and candid conversation. So I recommend you jump into your podcast player, search for Light Map by Sifter. Just search for Light Map, and you should be able to find it there. Definitely one to have a look at.
It's a big episode, and one that I hope plenty of people tune into, because it's a very interesting time in the games industry right now. Thanks to Brian Fairbanks from Salty Dog Sounds for composing the theme music. And Sifter is produced by Chris Button, Courtney Borrett, Kyle Pauletto, Fiona Bartholomaeus, Daniel Ang, and Adam Christou. Mitch Lowe is senior producer, and Gianni Di Giovanni is our executive producer. And if you like games coverage in written form, you can head to sifter.com.au for articles, interviews, and more. Thank you very much for joining us. See you next time.